Hi everybody, my name is Summer Weidman and I'm going to be talking today about invasive aquatic plants in Connecticut, how to identify them and how to manage them. With recorded presentations, I always find it more interesting when you can actually see the speaker, but some of my slides are a little busy, so you'll see my face moving around the screen as we go through so that I'm not blocking any content. But this is a picture of what happens to a lake when it's unmanaged. So here we have Squance Pond before Eurasian watermilfoil, and then we have Squance Pond after Eurasian watermilfoil comes in. There's algae at the surface. It's really hard to get a boat through, and pretty much the whole area becomes unusable. So that's one of the reasons why we got to manage these invasive plants. So most of the time when you hear about invasive plants, you hear about the terrestrial side of things, but aquatic plants are important as well. So invasive plants displace native species and they alter native ecosystems, very similar to terrestrials. And then from an economic perspective, they do reduce recreation, they lower property values and tax revenue, they interfere with navigation, and economic damages and management costs for the country are greater than $3 billion per year. So they can really wreak havoc on an area. This picture is a marina in the Connecticut River, and this is all hydrilla. And you see these boats and these slip here, they're not going to be able to get in and out very easily. So it's really important that we manage these because people aren't going to want to rent slips if they can't get their boats in and out, smoothly. But also native aquatic plants are important. We can't just have swimming pools with no plants. So native plants provide food and habitat for wildlife. They improve water clarity. They stabilize the sediments, remove nutrients, which reduces algal blooms, and they also have been shown to help resist invasion. So if you have a lot of native plants, a lot of diversity, a lot of different species, it's been shown that the lake is more resistant to an invasive species coming in and establishing. And then Connecticut Deep recommends that 20 to 40% coverage of the littoral zone is an optimal balance for a lake. So the littoral zone is anywhere light can reach the bottom. That's usually somewhere between the shoreline and 4 meters in depth. That can change depending on water clarity. But it's generally the shoreline of the lake. And so if light reaches the bottom, that means plants can grow. So you want about 20 to 40% of the littoral zone to be occupied by plants. And that ensures that the sediments are stabilized, nutrients are being removed adequately, you have enough food and habitat, but at the same time, it's not reducing recreation and all these other things that can happen if you go over that 40%. So what do we do? So I work for the Office of Aquatic Invasive Species. It's part of the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. We are a state agency based in New Haven, Connecticut. And we go from lake to lake throughout the state and we survey and map both the native and invasive aquatic plants. So you see here, this is the PI of the program, Greg Bugby, and then this is myself recording some data. So we will go to a lake, look at all the plants, identify them, and map them out using GIS. So you have, you end up with a map that has all the plant species. Each has an individual color, an individual layer, so you can see, where they're growing and what areas may need to be managed. You can calculate littoral zone coverage or anything else you may need. So how do aquatic plants get into a lake, especially the invasive ones? So the main method of introduction is actually the aquarium trade. So that's often what brings invasive aquatic plants from other countries, other areas to Connecticut is the aquarium trade. So identification is hard, which I will get to later. These plants often look very similar to natives. If you don't know what you're looking for, and the supply chain, there's a lot of people that are just trying to sell the plants, and they're not doing it on purpose. They're not selling invasives on purpose most of the time. It's just a mix-up of identification. So if someone goes and puts these invasive plants in their fish tank, oftentimes when the fish dies or when their child doesn't want the tank anymore, they don't want to kill anything, so they'll go just dump the whole tank in a lake. And that is how these plants get established and begin to spread. We've pulled full tanks, full fish tanks out of lakes that have an invasive species. Water gardening is another way that these species can be introduced. So you go and you want something for your backyard pond, you go to the store, you buy some plants, put them in, and then if it connects to a stream or something else, they can spread to the local lake. Once they're in the lake, they then spread throughout the state and elsewhere, most commonly through boat trailers. So in Connecticut, we have clean, drain, dry, so you're supposed to wash your boats between lakes so that you're not taking all of these plants like this trailer here in Lake Quanapog. And then we also have waterfowl. So geese, swans, ducks, they can fly from lake to lake, and if a seed or something gets caught in their feathers, they can then introduce it to the next lake. But what we mainly focus on is clean, drain, dry, and making sure that boaters are responsibly caring for their boats when they go from water body to water body. So in Connecticut, this is it's a very busy map, but it's locations of invasive plants found by us from 2004 to 2023. So there's about 15 invasive aquatic plants that have been introduced to the state, and about 56% of the lakes that we surveyed have at least one invasive species. And when you see these areas that have a bunch of symbols piled on top of each other, that's a lake that has more than one invasive species. The green checks mean that we didn't find any, we only found native plants. That's about 117 of the lakes that we've surveyed, and we want to see more of those. But the most common invasive plants, aquatic plants found in the state are Eurasian watermilfoil, minor naiad, curlyleaf pondweed, variable leaf watermilfoil, fanwort, water chestnut, and hydrilla. So those are the big ones, and then the others we see, but not so common. Normally it's in a water garden or some very specific small case that we see those. So what are our management options? So if you're tasked with managing an invasive species that has been introduced to a lake, what different tools do we have? So I'm going to go through them in more detail, but we have herbicides, benthic barriers, inspections for clean, drain, dry, education. We give workshops and talks and things, and then there's harvesting, both manual and mechanical, and then there's biocontrol like grass carp. One of the questions is always to control or not to control, and that's where that littoral zone coverage comes in, and you really have to figure out the balance of the presence of the invasive, the threat to the ecosystem, and how many natives are there, things like that. This is a video of Basin Lake, and this is all invasive fanwort, but what you notice in this video is there are a ton of fish that are enjoying this habitat. So some might say that we shouldn't control it because it's providing adequate habitat and the fish seem to be happy. And that's a valid point. Others may say, there's other areas in the lakes that have plenty of habitat, the fish will just go there. So it's really, the discussion of a lake association, the local town, stakeholders to decide whether or not to control. Prevention is key. Obviously, it's easier to manage a lake if the invasives never get there. So clean, drain, dry, our education, more boat ramps are having inspections and having cleaning stations installed so that boaters can more easily clean their boats between lakes, and we give these workshops. So there's a lot of different tools, but early detection, rapid response, the best way to manage invasive species is to keep them from spreading and to keep them from getting introduced in the first place. But after they're introduced and we have to manage, a lot of lakes turn to harvesting, both mechanical and manual. So this is a technique where you're essentially just removing the plants from the system. There's a lot of different ways to do this. This is a picture of Greg in Lake Quannapoig, and he has a hydro rake that he's using to chop up the plants, and then you have these big machines that can pull the plants out and scoop plants out and remove them that way. And then you have diver assisted suction harvesting, where divers go down with essentially like a big vacuum, and they sort of suck up the plants, or they hand pull the divers, and they put them into little nets, the plants that they pull. And all these are valid methods. Some work better than others, but one of the main issues with harvesting is these plants spread through fragmentation. So as you're breaking up the plants, a plant fragment needs to only be an inch or two long, and it can sprout roots and grow another plant. So as you're breaking these plants up, if you are letting these fragments float away, they can just add to your problem. So instead of making the problem better, you're actually just making it worse, because you're spreading it throughout the lake and you're not actually removing enough material to get rid of it. Oftentimes, harvesting is referred to as mowing the lawn rather than actually treating and managing the plant. And it can be expensive. Divers are expensive. These harvesting machines are expensive. But there's no herbicides involved, no chemicals, so people will turn to them. A lot of marinas use them to keep their slips clear, which is understandable. So it really depends on the plant that you're trying to control and what you're looking to get out of your management. These are just some quick videos of hand removal of Fanwort in Basin Lake. So this was hand removal using divers. So we had our camera system down looking, and we had divers that had these bags, and they would pull the Fanwort and put it into the bags. One of the issues they faced is as soon as they started pulling up, the sediment started to come into the water, and clarity became really hard to see. Clarity was really low, and so then you don't really know what you're pulling. You don't know if you've gotten everything. So definitely something to keep in mind. Benthic barriers are another mechanical type solution that don't involve chemicals. So these are essentially giant tarps. You can get them 10 feet by 20 feet by 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet, and every 5 feet there's rebar, these metal stakes that help weigh it down. One side of the blanket is white and the other side is black. We normally put them white side up so that they're easier to see. And you put them down and you overlap them a little bit to ensure that no plants can grow through, and then it suppresses plant growth. Now, you may be saying, how is that selective? Well, it's not. It's going to keep all of the plants from growing, and if you have any state listed mussels or things like that that can't move so easily, you do have to make sure that those are moved before applying these benthic barriers. You have to get a deep permit to do so. But we have found that in swim areas or slips or beach areas where you really don't want any aquatic plant growth, you want people to be able to swim and recreate, use their boats without getting caught in any plants, whether they're native or invasive. These can be a really good solution. We've done some studies in Lake Quannapoig and Benthic Lake where we put the blankets in April, leave them in for about 4 weeks or so, take them out before Memorial Day, and you have season-long control. So you have no more plants in that area for the full summer. And you could take them out, you could move them somewhere else, put them there for a couple weeks, you could move them around the lake, and it's an easy way to keep a beach area clear without having to use any chemicals or anything that some people might not want in their swim areas. They should be removed because sediment will settle on top of them. So you can see in this picture with Greg, he's lifting up an old benthic blanket that has been left in and forgotten. It had been covered in sediment, algae, and plants started growing just right on top of it. So it's really important that you either clean them or manage them in some way or remove them entirely from the system. They can be rolled up and reused the next year, so that they don't just become part of the lake bed. Drawdown can be an option in lakes that have a dam, so you can control the water levels. So a winter drawdown is when you lower the water level of the lake, expose the sediment, and you want to make sure it's deep enough that it's exposing the majority of the littoral zone. And through the winter, the soil freezes and the plants freeze, and this will kill the plants and ideally inhibit growth for the next season. So then the water level comes back up in the spring and you have less plants. This works pretty well with lily pads and other nuisance species. And Candlewood Lake's been doing this, Beesick Lake, a few lakes have been doing this for a while with pretty good results. Now, another issue, just like the benthic barriers, is this is not selective. So this is going to manage all of the plants. Hopefully, there weren't too many turtles and frogs hoping to, hibernate and to hang out in that water for the winter. But it is a pretty successful option, and it's one that doesn't require a lot of work, a lot of manpower to do. It's just a matter of lowering the water level and then bringing it back up. Dredging is an extremely expensive option. It's not one that happens often. So dredging is when you are removing the sediment, the muck, the lake bottom, and making it deeper. So we talked about that littoral zone, so that's where plants grow. So if you can get the lake bottom deeper than the littoral zone, you won't have plant growth. Again, this is a non-selective option, so this is going to keep your lake clear of pretty much all plants, but it is very expensive because you have to do something with the sediment that you're removing, and you have to go very deep. Most people think you can just dredge it a couple feet. You really have to go down below the littoral zone if you want to see any difference in plant coverage. This is a picture of Dream Lake in Guilford, Madison. This was decades ago, but dredging was very popular because the lake sediment, you could sell it and get money for it. So they were doing this essentially for free. But you do have to remove all of the water from the system to expose the whole lake bed, and then it's a huge operation to remove all of the sediment. So it really disrupts the aquatic plant life and just the ecosystem in general to remove all of that water. But these lakes today still have very limited plant growth because they did go down deep enough to limit the littoral zone. Aquatic herbicides are a very common control method, a management technique, because they are selective. So there's about 14 different herbicides that are approved for use in the state of Connecticut. You have to get a deep permit to use them, and there's a lot of requirements. You have to follow the label. You have to have a management company come in and apply them. There's all sorts of protocols in place to make sure that they're not overused. But each chemical affects different plants and in different ways. So you have systemic control, you have contact herbicides, and similar to terrestrial herbicides, but these are specific for aquatics. They have different rules, and a lot of lakes use them. Some people do not want chemicals. It can be very controversial, but it is definitely an option to keep in your toolbox because we do a lot of studies. Part of what the office does is research the effectiveness of management techniques. So we will do a lot of studies on the effect of herbicides, both on the natives and the invasives, to ensure that you're really controlling the invasives while the native plants continue to grow and succeed. Another option is biocontrol. So grass carp is what people most often think of, but there are insects and other ways to control aquatic plants. So grass carp are these sterile fish. They're triploid, so they cannot reproduce. You have to get a deep permit to put them in the lake. you put them in, and they're about 12 inches, and then they live anywhere from 10 to 20 years, and they get about as big as you can see in this picture, with a deep person holding one, and they eat plants as they grow, and they do a really good job of it. So one of the issues that can come up with grass carp is they are not selective. The idea was they would prefer invasive species like milfoil and hydrilla, but they will pretty much eat anything except lily pads. They really don't like lily pads. They will eat them if it's the only thing left. But what we have found in a handful of lakes that have used grass carp throughout the state is that the grass carp eat all of the plants, and there's nothing left in the lake. Which can be a huge problem because remember, we need that 20 to 40% coverage of the littoral zone, and when you don't have that, you disrupt the ecosystem, you don't provide food and habitat, and the sediments aren't held down anymore, so you get turbid waters, and it can cause a real problem. This is Lake Wabika. We surveyed it in 2005, and you can see that a lot of the lake was covered in coontail and some other native species, as well as invasive Eurasian watermilfoil. So they put in grass carp, and then we went back in 2019, and pretty much all that was left was lily pads, things that grass carp don't eat. Everything had disappeared. The water clarity was lower. People were very unhappy with the results, and there's really no way to remove the grass carp. They don't respond well to electrofishing. They're too big, and then they're vegetarians, and so they are hard to catch. You can't just put a worm on a hook and toss it in there and catch one. They're also very skittish. They do not like boats, and so they will just swim away anytime anybody gets close. We went back again in 2022, so a couple years later, and the lilies had spread, but unfortunately we still did not find any submergent aquatic vegetation like that coontail and the large leaf pondweed, things we had found before. So it's really just not a very good situation. Candlewood Lake, some of you may have heard this in the news, but it had had a very stable population of Eurasian watermilfoil for a long time. We mapped roughly 500 acres a year. You could see in this chart that it would increase and decrease. This was because of drawdown control, so they would do deep drawdowns and shallow drawdowns. And when they did a deeper drawdown, they had better control, so there'd be less watermilfoil the next year. But they put in grass carp in 2015, and then another set of grass carp were introduced in 2017. We were still seeing milfoil for a few years after that, and then in 2022 we found nothing. There was no Eurasian watermilfoil, no other plants except for these teeny tiny Elaeacorus and Elatanium, blanking on the common names, spike rush and something else, waterwort, very small grass-like plants that were in shallow areas that the grass carp couldn't get to. So Deep went in to try to remove the fish. Now they put in 3,800 fish in 2015 and 5,000 fish in 2017. In one day, Deep removed, I think, around 70 fish. So there's still plenty of fish out there, and they're going to continue to eat the plants as long as they are living. So we're working to study the lake. This is our largest lake in the state, so it is a very large water body. It might be able to handle, having no plants for a while before everything starts to collapse. So we'll be monitoring it to see what happens. But those were the management techniques that are most commonly used in the state and elsewhere for invasive aquatic plants. Now we're going to transition more into how to identify these plants, because they are hard to identify, and the quicker you identify it, the quicker we can solve the problem before it spreads. So our office has an invasive aquatic plant, clam, and mussel guide. It's available online as a PDF as well, but we do have hard copies if anyone is interested. They can contact me. But this will have pretty much all of the information on how to identify the different invasives. So a lot of what I'm going to cover is in the guide. I also wanted to mention that we have a new data repository that my coworker put together, and this is an online web app that you can access from our website, and this has all of the information on what lakes we've surveyed, where invasive plants are found. There's also an information tab that has a description of all the plants, very similar to what's in our guide, but it's a good interactive tool that aquatic plant managers can use to see what's going on in the state. So I'm going to start off with some plant terms. This is probably going to be reviewed as very similar to terrestrial terms, but these are the ones that we use to identify aquatic plants, so these are the important ones to know when it comes to a plant like Hydrilla. So fragment is a plant part that breaks off and grows to form a genetically identical plant. As I mentioned, this can only be an inch or two long, and it will sprout roots and grow a new plant. Tubers are modified underground stems for starch storage, similar to potatoes. And if a plant has tubers, it immediately becomes more difficult to control because these tubers will grow deep into the sediment and far away from the plant, and there's no way for us to see them or know if we've removed the tubers or know if the herbicide has gotten into the tubers. So plants with tubers can be a lot more difficult to control. Turions are a modified leaf bud that form on the stem or on the shoot of the plant, and then they will fall to the sediment and sprout a new plant the next season. So these are sort of hardened leaf buds, and they can survive in the sediment for years before sprouting. So they can also pose difficult management problems because you have to make sure you're treating your plants before the turions are formed, and make sure that you're accounting for that. And you may treat the plants one year, but you still have all these turions in the seed bank, so you need to make sure you're going year after year because these turions could sprout, and once a plant sprouts, it's going to drop a whole bunch more, and you're just going to end up in this cycle. So for leaf terms, we have a node, which is the point where leaves or branches attach to the stem. And then we have three common ways that aquatic plants have leaves. So you have opposite, which is two leaves across from each other at the same node. We have alternate, which is one leaf per node, and it's going to come from opposite sides of the stem. And then we have whorled, which is three or more leaves at the same node forming a ring-like arrangement. And now the whorls can be very important because we have some plants that I'm going to talk about that the native has whorls of 3 leaves and the invasive has whorls of 4. So you really just have to count the leaves, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what you're dealing with. We also have leaflets, which are, I think of them as mini leaves. They're leaf-like looking structures that when combined make one leaf. And you may say, well, how can I tell if it's a leaflet or a leaf? So you have to find that node. So you find that node, and either coming off of the node is the leaf or maybe a petiole, which is the leaf stalk. And then everything coming off of that node is one leaf. So if you see the node and you see a bunch of little leaves, those are leaflets, and that whole thing is the leaf. A rosette is a cluster of leaves that surround the stem at the same point. It's similar to a whorl, but it's only going to be at one part of the plant. Water chestnut is a good example of this, which I'm going to go over. But you'll have, a stem that has either alternate or opposite leaves, and then either at the top of the plant, which is common for aquatics, or at the bottom, you'll just have this cluster of a lot of leaves all in one spot. Tooth or teeth are sharp points along the leaf margin. And there are some species that you can see the teeth with the naked eye. Sometimes we need a hand lens to see them, but the amount of teeth that a leaf has can indicate, which species it is. So now I'm going to go through the most common invasives that we find in the state. The first one is Fanwort, Kabamba caroliniana. This plant has opposite leaves and long petioles. It's this bright green in the water. It kind of looks like pipe cleaners. That's how I look at it. It has these white flowers that will come to the surface. And it's called fanwort because the leaves fan out from the petiole. So when you're trying to identify this plant, you want the bright green, you want fanning leaves, you want to see long petioles and opposite leaves. There's actually a protected species in Connecticut, water marigold, and it's pretty similar. They often grow together. It's not quite as bright green, and it's a little bit more low growing, but they look very, very similar. But the main difference is water marigold does not have petioles. So you're going to see the same fanning shape of the leaf, but it's going to be coming right off the node instead of fanwort that has the petiole. That's why it's so important to know these terms and to know what you're looking for. This is a picture of fanwort growing in Moodus Reservoir, and this is what it looks like when it's full out and impeding recreation. You're not getting a boat through this, and you don't want to swim through it. There's some other invasives, variable watermilfoil going through it as well, but that bright green is that fanwort. Brazilian waterweed, or Agariodenza, is a plant that we often see introduced through the aquarium trade because it is so similar to native waterweed. But the main characteristic of Brazilian waterweed is its 4 leaves to a whorl. It does have these white flowers with 3 petals, and it's very robust. You're going to see a lot of leaves along the stem. It's going to be very bushy, very green. It looks great in an aquarium tank. But doesn't look so great when it's in one of our lakes. This is a picture of Brazilian waterweed matted out at the surface, and just native plants normally don't look like this. They normally are not this much of a nuisance, and this is just a monoculture. There's nothing else in here. It's just Brazilian waterweed. So Fence Rock Lake is a lake we've been studying for a while in Guilford. It's a little private pond, and in 2009 we found Brazilian waterweed, or Agariodenza, in a small part of the lake, and this is a lake where we found the full fish tank, so we have a pretty good idea of how it got in there. But you can see on the map there's a couple spots of bright blue or teal throughout the lake along the shoreline, but nothing too crazy. But we started tracking it year after year. So in 2010 it's a little bit more widespread. 2011, now you're starting to see it pretty consistently along the shoreline. 2012, it's really starting to become an issue. It's going to start impacting the natives that are growing. And then finally, 2013 was the year before we managed it, and it had taken up a lot of the lake. Pretty much everywhere in the lake that plants could grow, Agariodenza, or Brazilian waterweed, was there. So we used an herbicide to treat and track the progress, published a paper on it, and essentially Brazilian waterweed disappeared for a couple years while the natives decreased the first year after treatment, but then bounced back really quick. So we had all of our native plants and we had no Brazilian waterweed. It did show up a couple years later, but in a very small amount, and because we found it early, able to treat that and manage it so that it'll never become this widespread again. Hydrilla. Hydrilla is, some may say, the worst aquatic plant that you could have in a lake. It spreads pretty much any way you could think of. It has tubers, it has turions, it has winter buds and seeds and flowers. It spreads through fragmentation. It does anything it can do to spread. It looks very similar to both Brazilian waterweed and native waterweed, but it's going to have leaves of 5 or more per whorl. So you really want to count the leaves to see. And then in this picture here, we have water chestnut in the middle, but all of the rest of the image is matted out hydrilla. We now have 2 different strains of hydrilla in the state. So wandering hydrilla we've had for a while. This is Hydrilla verticillata peregrina. It's in Coventry Lake and the Mystic Seaport Pond. It's in the Silvermine River system, and it has whorls of 5. It's not as robust as our other strain. It does have tubers, and then it doesn't have nearly as many turions. Northern Hydrilla is what we found in the Connecticut River in 2016. So it's also called the Connecticut River strain, but this is Hydrilla verticillata subspecies lithuanica. And it's going to have whorls of 5 or more. So you may see 8 leaves, 12 leaves, 6 leaves, but 5 leaves, but you're going to see more than 5, where the wandering Hydrilla is pretty much just 5. It's very robust. You can see just in our herbarium mound side by side, it's much bigger than the wandering Hydrilla. It doesn't have tubers that we found, at least not in the same way that wandering Hydrilla does, which hopefully will make it easier to treat and manage. And then it has abundant turions. It produces a lot of turions. When you see it floating down the Connecticut River in October when it's starting to senesce, it's going to be chock full of turions that are going to fall to the sediment and sprout the next year. Just to give you an idea of how bad this Connecticut River Hydrilla can be, this is the Mattabassett River, which is a tributary of the Connecticut River. This is Greg's 18-foot boat that you can see in the image, and all of the green on either side of this little channel is Hydrilla. It's topped out, it's matted, turtles can walk across it. It's really, really aggressive, and we've gotten our boat stuck in it and have almost had to get towed out. It is a huge problem in the Connecticut River, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers is currently working on management techniques because this is a new strain. It's the first time this strain has been seen in North America, so we have to essentially start from square one with treatment. And with the river, it's tidal and it flows, so it's different than the lakes and ponds that we're used to. So when it comes to applying herbicides or any kind of management, we have to adjust to our different environment in the river. Unfortunately, the northern Hydrilla has been spreading throughout the state. We have now found it in 10 other lakes throughout the state. Most of the time we found it right near a state boat ramp. And then the blue in the map is where the Monisha strain or the wandering Hydrilla is found. So there's still, it's still popping up too in other lakes, but we're very worried about this northern Hydrilla since it's only ever been found in the Connecticut River, and now we're starting to find it elsewhere. So as I mentioned, some of these species can be easily confused. So here I have Brazilian waterweed and Hydrilla on either side, and then we have the native Elodea, the native waterweed in the middle. So the native waterweed has whorls of 3. It's going to be smaller, it's not going to be as robust, it's probably not going to grow as tall either. Then we have Brazilian waterweed, which is whorls of 4, and it's very robust. And then we have Hydrilla, which is whorls of 5 or more. So we have this saying, the more leaves to a whorl, the worse it gets. So you always want to count those leaves, especially in the Connecticut River. Elodea and Hydrilla are often growing side by side. So it can be confusing looking at them, and you really have to pull them up and count the leaves. If you do see something and you think it might be Hydrilla, just send us a picture or send us a sample. I'm happy to identify native waterweed all day if it means that we'll catch Hydrilla when we do find it. Another plant that's invasive to the state is common water hyacinth, or Pontidaria crassipus as it's now known for its Latin name. And this plant's interesting because it's not banned for sale in the state. So you can still buy this legally and put it in your backyard garden. The reason for that is up here it does not overwinter, so the frost kills it. So it's not something you're going to need to worry about. The issue is it spreads very rapidly. So this plant is free floating, floats on the surface, has these black roots that mat out and catch algae and all kinds of junk. And during the growing season, it doubles in size every 7 days. So you have one plant, after 7 days, you're going to have 2 plants, then you'll have 4 plants, and it's just going to keep spreading and take over a water body very quickly. It does have this beautiful purple flower, which people love, but down in Florida, this plant is a huge problem because it does survive all year round. So it clogs drainage ditches, irrigation pipes, canals. It causes a lot of problems down south. So we do have to be careful, because if we have mild winters and this starts to survive all year round, we could have a pretty severe problem. European water clover is another invasive to the States, not one we see often, Marsilia quadrifolia. It's pretty easy to identify. It looks like a four-leaf clover. And there's really not much to say about it. It's invasive. It's from Europe, and it can grow both out of the water and along the surface, as you see in these images. Parrotfeather is one of the three milfoils we're going to talk about, Myriophyllum aquaticum. This is the least often seen out of the three. It has these red roots, and then it has this emergent fluffy green part, and the leaves sort of look like parrot feathers. They're a little plasticky feeling, they're very thin, and it just pops up like a little tuft out of the water, and then you're going to see that bright red stem in the water with very few leaves. Then we have variable leaf watermilfoil, Myriophyllum heterophyllum. We find this plant pretty frequently. It's very robust, very thick. It kind of looks like octopus tentacles to me under the water. When you take it out of the water, the leaves collapse. And the key things, I'm going to go over this again in a minute, but the leaves are less than 1 inch apart. So it's going to have a lot of nodes stacked along the stem. So sometimes you can hardly see the stem because there are so many leaves. However, while there are a lot of leaves, there aren't that many leaflets. So when you look at the actual leaf, there's fewer leaflet pairs than another milfoil. The leaves are also a triangular shape compared to more rectangular. This is what variable leaf water milfoil looks like when it has invaded an area. This poor guy is chest deep in it, and this prop is going to be fouled very quickly by this milfoil, and it's also creating all these fragments, right? So it's just going to spread it. So if you imagine that prop ripping through this variable leaf water milfoil and then going to a different part of the lake or going to a different lake, it's going to be carrying those fragments with it the whole time. Eurasian water milfoil is the most common water milfoil that we find in Connecticut. It looks very dainty in this picture, but I have another picture in a second that's going to show you what happens when it is introduced to a system. So the leaves for Eurasian water milfoil are 1 inch apart, so you're going to see the stem very easily. There's a large space between the nodes. However, while there are few leaves, there are many leaflets. So you're going to see 12 or more pairs of leaflets per leaf, and then it has this rectangular shape compared to the triangle. This is a picture of Candlewood Lake before grass carp, and this was Eurasian water milfoil with that algae just all over it, and no one's going to want to swim in this. It's going to be hard to get your boat through it. It really causes a lot of problems. So here I have the two common milfoils side by side. I have Eurasian water milfoil on one side and variable leaf water milfoil on the other. And you can see the differences in the flowers. So Eurasian water milfoil has a thin spike where variable has a thick spike. And then you can see with variable, the leaves are really stacked close together. So they're less than 1 inch apart, where with Eurasian, you're going to see a large space between the leaves. Then, and this can sometimes be hard to see in the field, but variable does have a triangular leaf shape compared to the rectangular leaf of Eurasian. And then while Eurasian has fewer leaves, it has more leaflets, where variable has more leaves but fewer leaflets. So if you can somehow remember to keep that straight in your head, that could be an easy way. But regardless, both are invasive, both need to be reported, and both need to be managed. So if you see either of these, it's not a good sign. Minor naiad or brittle water nymph, also Naias minor. This is an annual, so it sprouts from seed every year. This plant is not often managed while it is invasive because it's low growing. So it's a very bushy plant. It's going to grow in only, a couple feet of water, and the leaves are heavily curled, and they have a lot of teeth that you can see with the naked eye. So it's called brittle water nymph because it feels brittle when you have it in your hands. It's going to be crunchy. It's going to be rough compared to a lot of the other plants that we have in our lakes. You can see it here. This is shallow water, and it almost looks like plumes of sediment, but it really is just this bushy minor naiad. And some years we see a lot of it, and some years we don't. It's annual, so it sprouts from seeds, so sometimes we have a lot of it, and then we go back the next year and we don't see very much. And that can make it difficult to control in some ways, but also you never know if it's going to be a problem or not. Curlyleaf pondweed is our invasive pondweed. There's a lot of native pondweeds to the state, but luckily this one's pretty easy to identify. It's Potamogeton crispus, and I refer to this as the lasagna plant because the leaves are very curly. So you'll look at a leaf and it's going to have a lot of waves to it. And then this is another annual like minor naiad, so it sprouts from its turions that it drops. So it produces these hardened buds that are going to fall to the sediment and then sprout a new plant. Curlyleaf's interesting because it is full grown earlier in the season than a lot of other plants. So if a lake has an issue with curlyleaf, you're going to see it topped out at the surface in June versus other plants like Hydrilla, you're going to see topped out in August. So this plant tops out in June and then it senesces. So if you go in August, you might not see it. If we have reports of curlyleaf, we know we need to get to that lake in June because if we go in August, we're not going to be able to get an accurate idea of how widespread it is throughout the lake. This is a picture of some lifeguards at Crystal Lake in Middletown trying to pull out curlyleaf. It can be a real problem even though it's an annual because it produces so many turions and it can sprout so many plants all at once, so it can still crowd out an area. All right, the last plant I have for you today, thank you for sticking with me, is water chestnut or Trapa natans. This can be pretty easy to identify because it has that rosette or cluster of leaves that's going to float at the surface, and then it's going to have a little white flower. There's a new strain down south that has a pink flower, so if you see water chestnut with a pink flower, let me know immediately because we have not found it here yet. But this plant is an annual, so it sprouts from these nutlets, which you can see in this picture of the spiky thing. Very uncomfortable if you step on it. So you may say, if it's just one nutlet, it's not going to be that much of a problem. Well, if you let that one nutlet sprout, it's going to grow 7 to 10 rosettes, and each rosette can produce up to 30 more nutlets. So this plant can spread tremendously quickly. You let one plant grow and the next year you could have, 200 more plants if all of those nutlets survive and sprout. It is very common in the Connecticut River, but because it is an annual, hand removal or mechanical removal is a very effective control method because once you pluck the rosette, that nutlet's not going to sprout again. So you've removed the whole thing from the system. So you want to get it early before the new nutlets have formed and before it drops the nutlets. It's also less biomass if you pull it while it's smaller. But there are a lot of volunteer groups that pull water chestnut in the river and elsewhere. This is water chestnut in Selden Cove and Lyme. This is part of the Connecticut River. Now this area is full of hydrilla, but back when we were here, before the hydrilla was introduced, you could see this large patch of water chestnut. You could see the flat rosettes as it spreads out, but once it's really crowded, the rosettes push each other out of the water, so you get that emergent look to it. So that's what I have for you today. That's an introduction to invasive aquatic plant management, as well as how to identify some of these species, because it is while there are similarities with the terrestrial world, the aquatics have their own set of intricacies to them. If you have any questions, feel free to email or call me, send us plant species, send us photos. We can identify them for you, and we can also give management advice as well. So feel free to reach out, don't be shy, and thank you for listening.